Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, the home of Navy thought. And we have one of the Navy's leading thinkers here, who is the president of the War College, Rear Admiral Jeff Harley. Sir, thanks very much for having us.
It's my pleasure.
The International Sea Power Symposium is going on and sort of disrupting you guys, I think, a little bit. But your mission is an academic mission to train the future leaders of the U.S. Navy and also America's allies. One of the charges that the Chief of Naval Operations, John Richardson, has made an imperative is high-velocity learning. What does that mean for you? You're new in the job, but what does that mean as you work to translate that idea into reality?
So high velocity learning really applies to everyone in the Navy. It's one of the Chief of Naval Operations specific lines of effort. And it's fundamentally the idea that if you see problems, you swarm the problems, you fix the problem, and then you communicate the solution to the rest of the entire organization. So you don't have stovepipes of people doing individual things. It's the sharing of that information. Sometimes people say it's an analogy to the scientific method. You have a hypothesis, you do a vision of how you're going to solve a specific problem, then you try to make efforts in that direction, and you constantly assess, and perhaps you can accelerate your assessment to find the correct path, so you create an engine of change that more rapidly addresses problems. That's what high velocity learning means to me.
How is that different, though? I mean, critics would look at it and say, well, how's that different from what, not just the Navy, but any of the military forces always did? These are learning organizations. They're steeped in history. They're always trying to figure out the next new trend. How is this guidance different from all other guidances, or even the fundamental approach from a service standpoint?
Well, I think it is very different. So it's not total quality leadership as we've had in the past. This is not some passing phase. This is a way of thinking about complex problems to try to assess things more rapidly to generate the required change. So it's a cultural shift. It's very, very different than some of these small efforts that were focused on very short periods of time. This is a fundamental change in the way that we do business.
Let me take you to military education writ large. There are those who are looking at it and saying, look, for example, the Air Force has been looking at readjusting. Air Force Chief of Staff Mark Welsh a couple of years ago said, we are by far in an order of magnitude the best educated, but do we really need multiple master's degrees, so much time in school, when really the measure of our success and merit is, for example, our operational prowess? As an educator, or as the person who's heading this educational organization, what are the keys to striking that right balance between education that is operationally relevant for the warfighter?
So I think it's about leader development, and the CNO has a leader development framework where we look at both competence and character. So what you talked about is the competence part. We learn how to fly, to drive submarines, to fight our ships, and to do so many other things that we do in our great Navy. But there's also a character development part, a part that leads to being a different type of leader, reflecting the change that occurs as we continue to evolve at a human dimension, at a personal level. So it's those pieces, and the real mission of the War College is to educate and develop leaders. And so we're looking at this through the lens of high-velocity learning, but also this two-pronged approach of both competence and character development.
When you're looking at, one of the things that the CNO, when we talked to him, was discussing the need for greater distributed operations. And the Navy's always prided itself on giving its commanding officers a lot of leeway to go and execute the mission. And now, obviously, there's a concern that, for example, China would be disrupting some of the major information networks, command and control networks, weather, logistics, and other systems that may complicate that. From a leadership and character development perspective, what are the leadership characteristics that are most important? And in your view, as somebody who's spent a lot of time in the Navy, what are the specific skill sets that have to be improved, given that we've been in an atmosphere where we can very fluidly communicate? What are the skill sets you think that should be built up so that the future generation of officers can work in a very information-denied space?
So our greatest asymmetric advantage over our near-peer competitors is our ability to think and to understand the fundamental principle by which we are supposed to fight. In the military, that's called mission command. It's to know what our task is in the event that we have disrupted communications, and to expect our leaders who are independent thinking, who have the understanding of their own accountability and responsibility, and they have an inherent desire to win. Those are the attributes that I think take us forward. Some of those are core attributes that the CNO has defined. Others are specifically relevant to this issue of mission command. But it really is our biggest advantage. It's our people that are able to do this and to do this so independently and well.
Technology has been changing education dramatically. Even for our kids, they're in high school. They don't have chalkboards anymore. They've got smart boards and a whole bunch of other things. There's Wiki or Google Pages and et cetera. From a technology standpoint, how is technology changing the education process, especially when you're trying to give people a strategic education foundation?
So the very first president of the US Naval War College was Admiral Stephen Luce. And he told us, and it rings true today, that change is relentless. We will always have this dynamic change, mostly a function of technology and changes within our global strategic environment. So for us, one of our core ways forward here at the college, one of the things that I hope to do, is to update the curriculum and the fundamental foundation of our college to futurize the course, to better understand the changes that are wrought in our strategic environment that have been brought by unmanned vehicles, by cyber, by information warfare, by these technologies, some of which have been here for a while, some that are clearly emerging as perhaps this third offset strategy idea that the Deputy Secretary of Defense speaks to. It's understanding those changes in the global strategic environment, and we are inculcating those technologies into our curriculum.
There's always been an international component to the school. Sometimes folks have gone to school here who have eventually become adversaries, which is a bit of a challenge. How do you ensure that the curriculum, you're opening the door to a lot of folks to come over here and to study freely, and yet they can also present certain challenges for you. How do you balance that fundamental need to engage, to learn from potentially somebody who may not be the closest friend of the United States, while at the same time, protecting yourself? I mean, that seems to be a very, very delicate balance.
Well, that's a great question. So international engagement is a huge part of the mission of the US Naval War College. We graduate about 500 U.S. students per year, and we also graduate about 100 international students every year as well, representing a great range of countries that are invited here to get what we think and what we know is the best education in the world. And we take the risk on the idea that we may be teaching critical thinking to somebody who later uses it against us. We take that risk because we know that the real value of the international engagement is building the partnerships and alliances and the personal relationships that is another asymmetric advantage that our country benefits from.
It was a little bit like the Malaysian chief of Navy mentioned to us. He was a student here 20 years ago. He's now the chief of the Malaysian Navy, and he said it's coming home.
There is a great record of international students who then go on to become the heads of their Navy. So it is a lot like coming home, and to have their expertise on display at the International Sea Power Symposium has been a real blessing.
Let me ask you a wargaming question. This is certainly one of the American homes of wargaming, if not the American home of wargaming, and Pringle Hall is legendary as the place where World War II really was won, and won in the interwar period when the United States Navy did some very, very innovative work to try to figure out what are some strategies we would need, or the United States Navy would need, to stay ahead of any potential competitor. And you had the colored rainbow war plans that flowed from there. And for folks in Washington, D.C., you can go to the Navy Museum where there's a copy of one of those war plans on display. But from a wargaming perspective, we are having a renaissance of wargaming. But there are some who question whether or not we're learning as much from them as we need to. That, are we paying attention to some of potentially the unpleasant results that war games may be exposing, or flaws or challenges? As a person who heads this institution, is that a concern for you? And how do you make sure that there's that connection from the strategic level to the warfighter level that existed and has existed and has made the wargaming here so effective over the decades? Or the centuries, you could even say. Century plus.
Absolutely. So what you're really describing is operations analysis across the entire spectrum, though. We do wargaming, which doesn't yield discrete results. It can provide great illumination, particularly based on specific leadership decisions, but in concert with campaign analysis, which is modeling and simulation writ large, and in concert with experimentation that takes place, there's a natural synergy that makes up this component of operations analysis. Those three things together provide the appropriate path forward in so many areas that translate from that strategic realm down to the tactical realm, just as you mentioned.
Sir, thanks so much for spending so much time with us.
It's my pleasure. God bless you.